Hi there, Sam Gostner here with VSCO Studios, and just a quick overview of the operation of VSCO Studios Chamber Orchestra 2 Professional Edition. Presumably you've already finished installing the library. You'll probably no longer have all these RAR files, and this is pretty much what you'll have. Documentation, instruments, samples, an NKC and an NKR file. So it's important to maintain the relative positions of the instruments, samples, and these two files because they rely on each other for the instruments to be able to function. So it's important to move them all together if you do end up wanting to change where your library is located. Now let's delve down inside the instruments folder. This is where you'll be spending most of your time. So you'll see we have a number of categories here: brass, keys, mallets, multis, percussion, strings, and woodwinds. So each one of these categories in turn is filled with a number of instruments, in this case 24. Now inside these folders we can dig down inside and we'll find actual NKI. So the NKI file is the instrument file type for Kontakt. And all we have to do to load one up is drag it into the Kontakt window. So it's loading up, and there it is. So let me just give you a brief overview of how the user interface works. So for those of you familiar with Kontakt, you're probably very familiar with this top part. This is just a general control panel found on all Kontakt instruments. But for those of you who aren't, let me just give you a quick walkthrough. So up here, this is the name of the patch. In this case, 7-player tenor trombone ensemble. This simply designates that it is a key switch patch. Over here we have the audio output. You probably won't be using this much unless you are into routing to different buses for certain reverb effects. Over here is the MIDI channel input. This is the actual channel that MIDI data is received from, be it from your keyboard or your DAW. So this is very useful and something you should definitely try to understand if you're planning on using a single instance of Kontakt and having multiple instruments in it, which is a very resource-savvy way to go. Over here we have the voices. So this number right here is the current number of voices. If I just play a few notes, see, I can make that number jump. And over here is the maximum number of voices. So if you see that the voice number is getting really close to this, you may want to increase the maximum number. You can also, of course, decrease the maximum number, and that should help a little bit with some of the efficient use of RAM, as is noted in the information box. Over here is simply a memory indicator showing how much RAM is used, and you want to use that in tandem with the overall memory indicator. Note that this is just for this instance of Kontakt up here. So this is just for the instrument, this is just for the instance. So that means if I had another window of Kontakt open, it wouldn't have that memory usage shown. Over here we have just basic solo and mute options, a tune knob for the entire instrument, a pan, and a basic volume knob. Now down here is the actual custom interface. You can open and close that by pressing the VSCO Studios logo here. Now you'll see over here we have these two mixer areas. So these are the actual mic positions. And you can see we have a slider here. This is the volume of the position. So if I were to put this here, this position would be attenuated by quite a bit compared to this position. Now down here at the bottom, this is for purging and loading the position. You'll see when I click that and it turns gray, we have nothing loaded in RAM. See, it has to load up the samples there. Now this position right here is actually a mono mic position. That means there's only one mic. It's a mono signal. So on all the mono positions, we have just a simple little pan slider down here that allows you to better place that in the stereo field. So let's say if we had our main mics and they indicated the trombones were off slightly to the right, then we could slightly pan our close mics to the right, and that way it would blend better with the actual placement in the stereo field. Now, if you want to modify the stereo placement of the instrument overall, we have a stereo width control and a stereo pan control. So these actually use delays and some advanced phasing techniques to really help better place, and more realistically place, the instruments in a real stereo environment. And if you use the stereo pan with the actual traditional pan that uses volume instead, you can get a really nice pan effect, very realistic. Just a little bit, you don't need to do much. Over here on the right, we have some basic effects. So this top one is a low pass and a high pass filter combined. See, here's the button to turn them on and off. And essentially, for those of you who aren't familiar with high pass and low pass filters, a low pass filter allows signals below a certain threshold, low signals, to pass or not be affected. Meanwhile, a high pass allows signals only above a certain threshold to pass or not be affected. So a low pass filter is useful for removing noise. So what you would want to do is bring this threshold down, and a high pass filter is useful for removing rumble, right? Low frequency stuff. And also hits. If a percussive thud in let's say a mallet instrument or a keyboard instrument, you can bring up the high pass filter. Just make sure you turn it on. Over here is a basic convolution reverb, so you can turn it on and off here. So pre-delay helps us determine the position we are in the room compared to the instrument. When a instrument plays a note, the signal goes in all directions. Some of it ends up going straight towards you. That probably reaches you first. The shortest distance is typically the fastest traveled. Now, the signal also goes off towards the walls, and some of that ends up bouncing off and then coming towards you. And that's typically what we call the reverb. So that's what pre-delay tries to emulate, is the effect of the signal having to go off and bounce off distant walls. Over here we have room. This is essentially just a wet-dry mix. So this controls how much of the actual reverb signal reaches the listener. Now typically I bring this between -15 and -5. Anywhere more than that, it can get a little bit too much. Anywhere less, you can't really hear it. Over here we just have a basic reverb size. Typically, most instruments can handle around 100, but some percussion especially, you want to bring it down into the 60s and 70s, or else it can get a little bit too washy. Down here we have some basic controls for the instrument. So this is an attack just like out of an ADSR control. So this allows us to soften up the actual tonguing or attack of the note, get a little bit softer of a sound at the beginning. And over here we have the volume of the releases. So these are actual sampled releases on the instruments that are played when we let go of a note. We can increase and decrease that as desired. Now this bottom part is all about controlling the articulations. So right here we have just a basic articulation indicator telling us what we have loaded, and you'll see when I click on these different articulation symbols, it'll change. Now we can also see down here we have the key switches, and as we change articulations, it gets highlighted. Now these little diamonds beneath are much like our on and off buttons. We can load and purge articulations. And you'll see if you watch the memory, it'll change as well as we load and purge. Over here we have a basic articulation lock. So this means if I try to switch articulations or click on the articulations or play them on a keyboard, it will not switch. So this is handy if you want to have a single articulation per instrument. Now over here we also have a key switch mover, which allows us by dragging back and forth to move where the key switches are located. And it moves them all together as a chunk. Now, let me just quickly show you what options we have in one of the scripted legato instruments. So down here you'll notice compared to the others we have a lot more knobs, but it's fairly straightforward. So this top row are all options related to legato. This bottom row are all options related to vibrato. This is a synthetic vibrato that you can add on, and of course a synthetic legato. So the sample start, typically you want to leave it as is. You can start a sample later on in the note, but it doesn't really have many advantages. Over here we have the length of the actual legato. Now you have to think of the legato, as being in two parts. So there's a pitch component and then there's a crossfade component where it's actually crossfading between the two notes. And the pitch component is where it's eliding between the two notes. The length controls essentially the amount of the crossfade component, and the intensity essentially the amount of the elision component. And so typically I put these between about 40 and 70. Lower numbers are more like the transition for a key or a valve on an instrument, so those can result in some really accurate trills. But higher ones are, people tend to like those quite a bit for just a soloistic writing component, so those are handy. Now offset is something super useful, especially when you get into expressive legato patches. We often want to turn that up all the way. So all the way, it sounds a little extreme, but 1000 milliseconds is actually only a second. And a lot of the expressive patches actually take more than that to get into their expressive phase. So the offset is when I play the second note, how long into that note it starts. Over here we have the vibrato options. So of course we have a vibrato amount. Typically around 25 to 40% is plenty. Pitch, you can kind of go from 3 to 12. Volume, 2 to 10. It doesn't matter exactly. It's pretty much to taste. And speed, typically you want to go a bit slower for brass instruments, a bit faster for certain strings and woodwinds. But once again, that's up to taste. And of course, like before, anything on here, you can right-click and learn a MIDI CC automation. So this means I can map any of these knobs and controls to my keyboard and control them in real time during the performance. I can also then access the MIDI CC data in my DAW and control the performance even more there. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at the operation of Vercillion Studios Chamber Orchestra 2 Professional Edition, and have a great day.